All right, folks, welcome back. So now we are going to talk about the role that the brain has in anxiety disorders. So one of the things that I've kind of mentioned is that with anxiety disorders, people become really, really good at seeing threats. Now, those threats may be there, but they may not be there. And so it's kind of easy to understand why the amygdala in particular is such a critical component here. So here we have some of the different components of the amygdala, including the lateral nucleus, the basolateral nucleus, and the central nucleus. And so these three areas together make up the amygdala. We also have an area called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. And what I want you to notice is that the amygdala receives a lot of different information and sends a lot of different information to different parts of the brain. So notice that the lateral nucleus gets a lot of different input from sensory cortex, so that will include seeing things that might be threatening, hearing things that might be threatening, touching things that might be threatening, or hurting ourselves potentially, and feeling that. The hippocampus can also send information to the amygdala as well as the thalamus. So when the lateral nucleus receives this, it sends output to many different areas, including the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, the central nucleus of the amygdala, the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala, but also sends information to the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the ventral striatum of the basal ganglia. And basically the idea is that these parts of the brain are going to help us either try to mitigate or manage these threats. So from these different areas, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is going to send outputs to our hindbrain, areas like our hypothalamus, midbrain, pons, and medulla. And those are basically going to affect our bodily reactions, our physiological arousal, and also, especially with the hypothalamus, that's really going to kick off that fight or flight reaction. And you can see here, that the central nucleus will also be sending that information, and the basolateral nucleus will be sending that information to the central nucleus as well. So we get input from the environment that the lateral nucleus will basically register as a threat, and then it will send outputs to different areas of the brain to basically engage in physiological and cognitive and bodily behaviors to help us manage that threat. So the amygdala is really critical for processing things like fear and anxiety. If you've had me for biopsych, you kind of know that the amygdala is very, very active for negative emotional stimuli. That includes pictures, that includes music, stories, words, even negative looking faces when they're not consciously perceived. And for people that have anxiety disorders, they tend to show a heightened response to that negative stimuli above and beyond people that do not have anxiety disorders. We've also found that in animals, if you electrically stimulate the amygdala, animals end up displaying signs of anxiety and fear. If you damage the amygdala and lesion the amygdala, you see fewer fearful responses. So this kind of demonstrates that the amygdala is really critical for registering stressors and threats in the environment. Now, the central nucleus of the amygdala is really critical for responses to fear. Its activation and its processing leads to things like these. Activation of the autonomic nervous system. With activation of the autonomic nervous system and with output being sent to the brainstem, that will also lead to enhanced bodily reflexes, increased vigilance, as well as activation of the HPA axis, which means that eventually cortisol is going to get released to help manage that stress. So you can see here that the central nucleus of the amygdala has a lot of different outputs here. And so here are a couple of different examples. So if we stimulate, it sends input to the lateral hypothalamus. That's going to lead to activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So we get higher heart rate, blood pressure, paleness, pupil dilation. We also get stimulation of the motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, which can actually lead to parasympathetic activation. And ideally, this would counteract the sympathetic nervous system. But what we often tend to find is that in certain cases, it leads to extreme reactions. The parasympathetic nervous system is often responsible for digestion. So under periods of extreme stress, this can lead to the development of ulcers due to too much stomach acid, urination, and defecation. Stimulation of the parabrachial nucleus leads to increased respiration. Stimulation of the ventral tegmental area, the locus coeruleus, and another area called the pedunculopontine nucleus. So in the pons, we're going to get activation of dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, thus leading to enhanced vigilance and heightened arousal. The nucleus reticularis, better reflexes. The periaqueductal gray, that could lead to freezing behavior. Trigeminal and facial nuclei, that will lead to expressions of fear. And the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, that is the release of adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone, which will eventually lead to release of glucocorticoids in the HPA axis. So you can see that the amygdala has a lot of different outputs that will lead to a lot of anxiety and fear-based behaviors. So let's talk about the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis and anxiety. So as I've mentioned, the amygdala processing plays a central role. It gets a lot of inputs from different parts of the brain, and it sends a lot of outputs to the brain and to the body. The behavioral responses in particular may be initiated by the BNST, and this is partially because it projects to many of the same brain regions as the central nucleus of the amygdala. So here's kind of an example. So let's kind of look at a fear-based versus an anxiety-based response. So remember, as we talked about last time, a fear response is an emotional and behavioral response to something that is definitely threatening right now. There is a clear and present threat. Anxiety is based on a hypothetical possibility of a future threat. So in a fear response, the central nucleus of the amygdala will play a role in a response to very sudden aversive events. The BNST, on the other hand, tends to initiate an emotional response when the stimuli are less precise and when they're potential predictors of danger, not actual clear and present danger. And so the BNST creates a state of sustained preparedness for unclear danger and prolonged anticipation of unpleasantness, that sense of dread that you get. So what about the role of the amygdala in memory? So because the amygdala is directly in front of the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is really critical for memory formation, it's probably pretty straightforward to expect that they will influence each other. And this is true, they do. The amygdala largely aids in the formation of emotional memories. And this is especially true when we look at fear conditioning or conditioned emotional responses in animals. And this is a case where we are making an association between an environmental stimulus and an aversive stimulus. So for an example, a conditioned fear response might be that I'm working with a rat and I play a tone. The tone signals that very, very soon the rat will receive a slightly unpleasant foot shock. And so one of the things that we find is that if I keep playing the tone and then deliver the foot shock, typically what rats will do when they are presented with an aversive stimulus like a foot shock is that they freeze. Eventually, over time, if I pair the tone with the foot shock, the rat will begin to make the association that the tone signals that the foot shock is about to arrive. And because of that, they will start to freeze in anticipation of the tone. So we're going to make an association between an environmental stimulus and something that's aversive. For human beings, that might be being in public places and potential panic attacks. And this is established pretty quickly, and it's very, very long lasting. And as I mentioned, because the amygdala has many connections with the hippocampus, it can also contribute to memory consolidation. One of the things that we find is that it's much, much easier to form emotional memories and remember emotional memories. Emotion often enhances memory formation just because of those links between the amygdala and the hippocampus. So what about other parts of the brain? So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about those. The amygdala is very, very critical for anxiety disorders, but there are other parts of the brain that can modulate these responses. In particular, the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, located just underneath it, are very, very important for potentially inhibiting anxiety-reducing thoughts. Many of our anxiety based behaviors and our anxiety-based thoughts are due to these subcortical regions of the brain, which are very, very primitive. Comparatively, the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate are newer parts of our brain. They're more sophisticated in their processing, and they basically work to inhibit those emotional responses. So ideally, they can exert inhibitory control. They can say, hey, maybe this isn't a threat. And that can allow us to cope with different types of situations. One of the things that we'll find with a lot of people that struggle with anxiety disorders is that there's often an imbalance between the areas like the amygdala. They're often going to be overactive. And what we're going to find is that areas like the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate that are designed to exert that inhibitory control are often going to not be as effective as in reducing that heightened emotional state. So what neurotransmitters are involved in anxiety disorders? As we see in mood disorders, that will include, because of the HPA axis, there will often be issues related to corticotropin releasing factor, adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, and glucocorticoids like cortisol. In addition to that, we also see that norepinephrine might be involved, GABA might be involved, serotonin, as well as dopamine. So let's talk about norepinephrine in particular. Norepinephrine is the primary neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system, and so it stands to reason that for people struggling with anxiety disorders, norepinephrine might play a major role. So going back to the locus coeruleus, that is a major cluster of noradrenergic cells that basically project to several different brain areas. So the locus coeruleus has 3 different types of neurons inside of it. One kind of corresponds to general wakefulness and alertness, like sleep-wake behavior. Other types of neurons in the locus coeruleus respond to non-noxious environmental stimuli. And then here's what's really critical. There's a third group of neurons within the locus coeruleus that respond specifically to stressors, as well as stress-induced corticotropin releasing factor. And what evidence do we actually have for norepinephrine playing a role in anxiety? If we electrically stimulate the locus coeruleus, or if we administer a drug like yohimbine, which is an agonist of norepinephrine. It increases norepinephrine release. We do actually find that it induces alerting and fear responses in animals. And if we give humans yohimbine, it often induces panic attacks. And so it stands to reason that a lot of patients that have anxiety disorders often have an abnormal or oversensitive sympathetic nervous system response. They have issues regulating their autonomic nervous system. It's part of the reason why I am a big believer in things like meditation and especially deep breathing from the diaphragm. We have vagus nerve outputs in the diaphragm. And the vagus nerve is a part of that parasympathetic nervous system. If you can stimulate the vagus nerve, you can potentially stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system and calm that sympathetic response down. And I know that that certainly worked for me. I'm not saying it works for everybody, but it might work for some people. What about the role that GABA plays? So GABA-induced inhibition actually regulates activation of the central nucleus in the amygdala. So glutamatergic neurons, glutamate neurons from the prefrontal cortex actually provide top-down control of amygdala processing. So if we want to inhibit those emotional responses, we need glutamate neurons in the prefrontal cortex to do that. But what we end up finding is that for a lot of people that struggle with anxiety disorders, there might be impaired GABA functioning. And what ends up happening is that this could lead to overactive signaling in the amygdala. If GABA isn't working to basically regulate the amygdala goes into overdrive. And because of that, the prefrontal cortex can't actually do its job to inhibit the amygdala's functioning. So it could be a case where we don't have enough GABA to inhibit the amygdala, or GABA is not being processed appropriately. So for a lot of people that are struggling with anxiety disorders, benzodiazepines like Xanax are pretty common treatments. We can also do barbiturates. And I never actually pronounce barbiturates correctly, but barbiturates include things like amytal sodium, seconal, or nembutal, or things like that. And these are hardcore tranquilizers. Both of these types of drugs cause sedation, and they reduce anxiety by binding to modulatory sites. If you look at GABA receptors, many of them actually have a binding site for benzodiazepines as well as barbiturates. And additionally, we do find that GABAergic receptors are in high concentration in both the amygdala and the limbic system, areas like the hippocampus, as well as the frontal lobes. So here, what we are looking at are areas of activation where these GABAergic neurons will tend to be. So now let's talk a little bit about benzodiazepine binding and anxiety. So one of the things that we find is that reductions in those benzodiazepine binding has been found in selected brain areas of individuals with GAD and PTSD. So kind of going back here, you can kind of see we have a lot of overactivity here, but what's really critical is that for areas involving the limbic system, we have a lot of underactivity in those GABAergic regions. So not just focusing on this overactivity, but also noting the underactivity, particularly in areas of the limbic system, including the amygdala. So we do find that this reduction is found both with people that have generalized anxiety disorder as well as PTSD. And because of this, because there are those fewer binding sites, GABA cannot appropriately inhibit the amygdala. And this can lead to things like uncontrolled panic attacks, phobias, generalized anxiety, and the hyperarousal and the irritability that we tend to see in PTSD. So what about serotonin? So serotonin actually modulates anxiety in a very complex fashion. The serotonin 1A receptor has received the most attention. We're actually going to talk about one anxiety reducing drug, buspirone or Buspar, that actually works on the serotonin 1A receptor. So one of the things that we find, the first line treatment for most people that have an anxiety disorder is usually not a benzodiazepine or a barbiturate. It's actually an antidepressant, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. This blocks reuptake of serotonin and prolongs its effects. Now, here's where it gets kind of tricky. For some individuals, before the SSRI is working to full effect. And remember that for a lot of SSRIs, we start to see some effects at 2 weeks, but we ultimately see full effect in about 4 weeks. What we're going to see initially is that for people suffering with anxiety disorders, this might temporarily increase their anxiety. And so it can be really tricky for people with anxiety disorders to stay on SSRIs because of this. One of the things that we do find, though, is that people with anxiety disorders have to take it for a longer period of time because there are going to be these adaptations that are required for them to be effective and to reduce those anxiety symptoms. So what about dopamine? Dopamine actually is a modulator here, and that's because we have a lot of dopamine projections from the ventral tegmental area to the prefrontal cortex and limbic regions. So that would basically be here are mesocortical pathways starting from the VTA to the cortex, and then our mesolimbic pathway starting from the VTA and ending in the limbic system. One of the things that we find is that during periods of stress, we actually see increased firing of mesocortical neurons. And additionally, this increases dopamine turnover in the prefrontal cortex. So maybe the responses to stress have become reinforced in some ways, and that's kind of interesting. Now, one of the things that we know is that early stress in life can affect anxiety and the brain. Early stress will often alter the HPA axis, and this ends up causing a hyperactive hormonal response to stress. And that leads to the role that epigenetics plays here. So for those who may not know, epigenetics is basically the idea that genes can only interact, that genes interact with environment, that you may have a predisposition for certain types of disorders, but those will only manifest themselves and those genes will only express themselves in certain types of environments. It's part of the reason why people are becoming more and more interested in what are known as ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Generally, what we tend to find is that the more ACEs that you have, the greater the likelihood that you could potentially suffer from things like anxiety and depression, because these will turn on these genetic predispositions. So one of the things that we do find is that if you knock that HPA axis off kilter, this can lead to damaging effects, especially if that HPA axis is constantly on. Too much stress is really bad for you, and too many stress hormones end up damaging your brain. Prolonged stress and that elevation in glucocorticoids, those stress hormones, ultimately can kill and damage the cells of the hippocampus, which will affect your memory and potentially your cognition. So we're going to go ahead and stop here, and next time we will talk about treatments for different types of anxiety disorders.